Ukraine has already managed to cause serious damage to Russia with its long-range drone strikes. Oil refineries have been a key target, with Russia now dealing with gasoline shortages thanks to 40% of its refining capacity being taken offline over the past couple of months. But it's about to get worse. Much worse. Russia was already having a hard enough time dealing with Ukraine's drones. Now a new weapon has taken flight. Ukraine just unleashed the Flamingo missile, and Russia was powerless to stop it. We got our first hints that Flamingo has evolved from a concept into a combat-ready and usable weapon from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. October 6th saw the Kyiv Post suggest that Ukraine hasn't just been using drones to conduct its recent long-range strikes against Russia. Missiles are in the mix too, Zelenskyy says, which is the strongest hint we have yet that Ukraine's Flamingo missiles are flying into Russia as we speak. RBC Ukraine offers more, noting that Zelenskyy dropped his hints during a joint press conference with Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof. Referring to a recent string of videos shared on social media, you can almost imagine Zelenskyy offering a wink and a nod to the gathered journalists in Kyiv as he said, "Based on those hits, I think people can understand from the fragments on social media where drones are being used and where they are not." That last part of the quote is the important bit. Even a brief mention of strikes inside Russia is practically confirmation that Ukraine is using its missiles for its long-range strikes. What else does it have that could do a similar job? Western-made missiles such as the ATACMS have been quietly blocked by the Pentagon, the Wall Street Journal reported in August. It's possible this block, which required Ukraine to go through an approval process ending with a yay or a nay from US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, may have been lifted. But even if it has, Ukraine can't hit much more than the border regions of Russia with its Western-made missiles. They simply don't have the range. The Flamingo does. However, Zelenskyy declined to say anything more after dropping his hint. No operational details were provided, which means we don't know for certain when or where Flamingo has taken flight. There is one possible strike to cover, so keep watching to find out what that is. Zelenskyy at least had a good reason for offering no more than a hint. Ukraine doesn't want to give Russia any chance to prepare for Ukraine's tactics, no matter what those tactics might be. If the Flamingo is being used, Ukraine wants to ensure Russia can't come up with a countermeasure, such as deploying air defense systems to the sort of targets Ukraine reveals it struck. Ukraine has clearly learned from its past mistakes. Back in 2023, Ukraine spent several months hyping up a counter-offensive that was supposed to break Russia's lines and allow Ukraine to retake the bulk of its occupied territory. The combination of time between planning and execution, and the fact that Ukraine was so open with what it intended to do, gave Russia a chance to prepare layered defenses that pulled Ukraine into a quagmire. Some progress was made. However, Ukraine didn't make anywhere near the game-changing advances that it wanted to make. A harsh lesson was learned in 2023. Ukraine cannot let Russia get a sniff of what it intends to do. We did get a few numbers from Zelenskyy during the press conference, the Kyiv Post adds. Zelenskyy reiterated a past claim that around 60% of Ukraine's deep strikes on Russian territory are being conducted by unmanned systems, some of which can travel over 930 miles to reach their targets. That leaves 40% of strikes unaccounted for. Yet more fuel for the Flamingo usage fire. Building on the hints Zelenskyy dropped, the Kyiv Post also reached out to the Ukrainian General Staff to ask if they could confirm any reports of Flamingo missiles being used against Russia. The outlet didn't get the answer it was looking for. "No, we do not have such information at this time," the General Staff said. It does have the information, but like Zelenskyy, Ukraine's General Staff is taking no risks when it comes to revealing information that Russia could use against Ukraine. Loose lips sink ships, as the idiom goes, and flapping gums could thwart the Flamingo in flight. Still, there's enough of a hint in Zelenskyy's words to tell us that the Flamingo is active, and we might just know one place where Ukraine's powerful new missile has made an impact. In an October 5th report, The Economist claimed that there are believable reports the Flamingo has been used, possibly against Russia's oil refineries. In an article discussing the impact of 2 months of constant long-range strikes against Russia's refining capacity, the outlet said, "There are also reports that FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles have begun to be used. They are much faster than the drones, flying just 50 meters above the ground, with a range of over 3,000 kilometers and packing a huge punch thanks to a 1,150 kilogram warhead. That's over a ton of firepower, by the way, which showcases just how devastating the Flamingo would be when it hits its target. However, The Economist doesn't mention a specific refinery strike. It just confirms that the Flamingo is in use. Details of a more specific strike actually come from an August Militani report. And for this strike, which may well have been Ukraine's first using the Flamingo, it wasn't a refinery that ended up in Ukraine's crosshairs. It was Crimea. The outlet says that a series of strikes conducted against patrol boats and an FSS outpost on the occupied peninsula weren't conducted using Neptune missiles, as initially believed. Instead, Ukraine had deployed Flamingo missiles in what Military dubs a triple launch from the Ukrainian coast on August 30th. Those missiles lifted off one after another, using solid-fueled boosters to do so, before they careened toward their targets. Satellite images of the FSS outpost before and after Ukraine's strike also seem to confirm that Ukraine used a weapon that hits a lot harder than its Neptune missiles. Though the low resolution of the images means that the full extent of the damage can't be determined, what can be seen is that the outpost's main building has been decimated. There is also fire damage evident in the surrounding area, suggesting an explosion that the Neptune and Ukraine's drones can't create. We have to stress that none of this is confirmed at this point. Ukraine certainly isn't going to tell us if it has used Flamingo missiles to strike Crimea or any of Russia's oil refineries. However, circumstantial evidence is starting to build. Footage and photographs of the aftermath of strikes that hint at the use of a more powerful weapon than any Ukraine has deployed previously are making the rounds, and with Zelenskyy's hints regarding the social media footage and Ukraine only using unmanned systems in 60% of its strikes against Russia also being put out there seems to be only one conclusion: Flamingo is active, and it's hitting Russia hard. That brings us to what we know about Flamingo so far. As with the strikes themselves, Ukraine hasn't revealed a huge amount about the inner workings of its new missile. However, several sources have compiled information based on Flamingo showcases at exhibitions and claims from Ukrainian sources that give us a good idea of just what the Flamingo is capable of. We've already touched on a couple of the missile's features. It's believed that the Flamingo has a 3,000-kilometer range, which amounts to about 1,864 miles. That's long enough to put almost any strategic target inside Russia in range, including the capital city of Moscow. The only places Flamingo can't hit in Russia are in the Far East regions of the country, which aren't especially relevant to the Ukraine war anyway. The missile also has a warhead that weighs over a ton. To offer context as to how much damage such a warhead could cause, we can use the UN Safeguard tool to estimate the size of a Flamingo blast. Assuming a fully stocked warhead and a strike against a target that is 1,500 kilometers away, the Flamingo would explode with enough force to be immediately fatal to anybody within a 24-meter distance. That's around a 78-foot blast zone when it comes to direct human casualties, with those outside of this range still being at risk of massive lung damage and perforated eardrums. Buildings fare even worse. Any houses or non-armored structures within 35 meters, which is about 114 feet, will be completely demolished by a Flamingo blast. Buildings can also be rendered uninhabitable over a distance of over 4 times the house destruction distance. Flamingo packs a heavy punch. Plus, this is a strike conducted against a target that is 1,500 kilometers away. Shorten the distance the Flamingo has to travel, and it can do even more damage, Safeguard's tool reveals. Beyond its range and its destructive capabilities, we also know that Ukraine has blended old technology with new to craft the Flamingo. The Economist offers the details in its October 5th article, where it discusses what the Flamingo's manufacturers, Firepoint, used to make Ukraine's new weapon. To make the FP5, Firepoint uses repurposed Soviet-era turbofan engines, and its carbon fiber fuselage takes just 6 hours to produce, the outlet says. Ukraine, once again, has figured out how to take the old and turn it into something new and lethal. That's a long way from how Russia uses Soviet-era technology. All the Kremlin can think to do with its old weapons is send them into Ukraine to be destroyed. It's gotten to the point that Russia is on the verge of running out of everything that it has by 2026, as you'll discover if you check out our video covering how Russia's war of attrition has come back to bite the Kremlin. There's also the name to think about. Flamingo is hardly the most threatening name for such a powerful missile, but there's a reason why this moniker was chosen. According to the Kyiv Post, a minor manufacturing error in the first batch of the missiles resulted in them coming out pink. That batch was nicknamed the Flamingo, and the name has stuck since then. If you want something more official sounding, The Economist points out that the missile is also known as the FP5. A direct comparison to a Western missile has also been made. The closest Western equivalent to the Flamingo appears to be the US Tomahawk. Ukraine's missile seems to have several advantages over its American counterpart, starting with its cost. A Tomahawk missile can cost up to $2 million, depending on the block being ordered. A Flamingo comes at a quarter of that cost. and it delivers both a longer range and a heavier payload to its target. The trade-off, The Economist says, is that Tomahawk missiles are likely more precise and harder to shoot down than Flamingo missiles. But even then, the Flamingo has a few tricks up its sleeve. We mentioned earlier that the missile can fly as close as 50 meters to the ground, which makes it difficult for air defense radars to pick up. Thanks to its high range, The Economist adds the Flamingo could also change vectors several times en route to a target, which could also be enough to fool or evade air defense systems. Ukraine's new missile, even being roughly equivalent to a US Tomahawk, signals a significant leap in Ukraine's long-range capability, Army Recognition adds in its own article covering the Flamingo's first strike in Russia. Its combination of heavy payload, long reach, and simplified guidance design makes it a weapon optimized for high-impact strategic targets such as industrial plants, ammunition depots, and logistics centers far beyond the front line, Army Recognition says. It also adds the interesting detail that Ukraine may have used the Flamingo to strike targets in Belgorod as well as Crimea. But as with the Crimean strikes, there's no official confirmation from Ukraine. It seems almost certain that the Flamingo is good to go and that Ukraine is using it to conduct multiple strikes. That leads us to ask what comes next now that Ukraine's devastating new missile has entered the battlefield. One man believes the missile could be a game changer. That man is the former director of the CIA, General David Petraeus, who had this to say in October. It's typical Ukrainian ingenuity, where they've taken old Soviet bombs, put those explosives on the nose of a cruise missile they have designed with a jet engine and guidance system, Petraeus said. And that will be a game changer. I think if that can be produced in substantial numbers, that will have an enormous effect on the battlefield in the Russian Federation, and that's very, very important. The part about substantial numbers is key here, as the Flamingo isn't going to be of much use to Ukraine if it can only build a handful of them. As is so often the case, money is going to determine just how impactful the Flamingo can be against Russia. Zelenskyy knows that as well as anybody. On October 6th, Pravda reported that Ukraine's president had dropped even more hints about Ukraine's potential, assuming its Western partners are willing to keep dipping their hands into their pockets. Ukraine's defense industry, which has increased by many times since the Ukraine war began, has the capacity to reach $35 billion in production by 2026, Zelenskyy said. Having capacity and hitting that number are two very different things, which is where help from the West has come into play. Having said that, Ukraine is trying to raise as much money as it can from its own defense industry. In cases where it has a surplus of the weapons it's building, it's able to give its partners something in return for the cash they pump into Ukraine's defense industry. Agreements are already in place to open export-import platforms in Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. The task is to launch these platforms by the end of the year, Zelenskyy said. Those platforms would keep money pouring into Ukraine's coffers, meaning it's no longer solely building to use anymore. That would be huge for Flamingo. Would mean that Ukraine has cash to spend on building more of the missiles that it knows can cause major problems for Russia. Right now, Flamingo production could use a boost. The Kyiv Post notes that Firepoint had a production capacity of 1 missile per day earlier in 2025. However, it had set itself a goal of building 7 Flamingo missiles daily by October. Assuming Firepoint hit that goal, Ukraine would have an annual influx of 2,555 missiles per year at a cost of around $1.27 billion. If more money is coming in, those numbers could be pumped up to the point where Crimea, Russia's oil refineries, and almost any other target that Ukraine chooses could be wiped off the map. Assuming production is achieved at scale, the Flamingo has the potential to be a game changer far beyond the Ukraine war. Army Recognition points that out, suggesting that Flamingo stands apart in Europe. Long-range missiles developed on the continent, which include the Storm Shadow and Germany's Taurus, have shorter ranges, more limited payloads, and come at a higher cost. Like the Tomahawk, these European missiles are likely more precise than the Flamingo. However, that won't be much of an issue if Ukraine gets to the point where it can build Flamingo missiles in bulk. Ukraine's missiles likely won't replace those that European countries are already building. However, it will offer an alternative that allows for different types of strikes while giving Europe a chance to continue funding Ukraine while building its collective stockpiles. Why does precision not matter as much anymore? Because many Western nations are attempting to make a shift towards something that Forbes claimed was an urgent military need back in 2023, affordable mass. The outlet's senior contributor Lauren Thompson discusses the problem the West faces from the American perspective when it comes to sheer volume. America's military is credited with having the world's most advanced weapons, but because such weapons are costly, it's deficient in mass, Thompson says. Some experts believe that the current stock of long-range, precision-guided munitions would run low within weeks after a war with China commenced. The West is looking for a new long-range weapon, combines quick manufacturing with simplified guidance, and the reuse of old components to create affordable mass. The Flamingo fits the bill, meaning there is a clear case for the West practically throwing money at Ukraine to get this missile into mass production. Russia knows all of this. It knows that more Flamingo missiles would mean that Ukraine can not only hit, but absolutely devastate many of the country's most important military and military-adjacent facilities. And if Ukraine's constant strikes on Russian oil refining show us anything, it's that Russia has nowhere near the amount of air defenses it needs to guard some of its most critical domestic assets. Russia can't allow Ukraine to get to the point where the Flamingo is being stockpiled by the thousands. So it's trying to nip Flamingo production in the bud. On September 4th, TVP World reported that Russia had made an attempt to destroy a rumored Flamingo missile production facility as part of an overnight strike against the Ukrainian city of Kalush. The city was subjected to one of Russia's largest drone and missile strikes of the war, TVP World says, with the main target being the Kalush Industrial Hub Park, where Flamingo might have been built. Russia's strike was successful in that it set several of the buildings in that industrial park alight. As for whether Russia managed to hit a Flamingo production facility, we simply don't know. Russia hasn't claimed to have done so, and Ukraine likely wouldn't reveal if it had. Still, this attempted strike proves that Russia knows just how dangerous Flamingo is to its ambitions of subjugating Ukraine. When the Flamingo flies, Russia burns. And the Kremlin appears powerless to stop it, just like it was powerless to stop one of Ukraine's most impressive strikes on Russian territory yet. Ukraine just carried out a 1,000-kilometer precision strike against one of the Russian Navy's newest missile ships. Ukraine's strike capability continues to grow as more Russian ships sink. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Ukraine's latest and greatest missile. And thank you as always for watching.